This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Asian stocks track Wall Street lower as U.S. tech earnings fail to impress. Tesla posting its fourth straight profit miss as Alphabet faces pressure to keep up on AI. Kamala Harris hits the campaign trail with a direct attack on Donald Trump, telling Americans they face a stark choice in November. Plus, European banks begin reporting today with the likes of Santander and Deutsche Bank on the docket. More details later as investors focus on trading revenue and investment banking fees. Well, good morning again, everybody. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Versace in Dubai. Let's get you straight to the markets because we were looking for clues yesterday that this tech-fueled rally was going to continue. And yet the results that came through yesterday after hours, Alphabet and Tesla disappointed, setting the tone for today. You can see both S&P futures and NASDAQ futures leaning towards the negative, down about 0.4 and 0.6% respectively. Also keeping a close eye on the Indian rupee. Why? Well, we had that budget yesterday, the first since the election. A lot of new information came through, particularly with their deficit forecast slightly smaller than what people had anticipated. And yet, what we saw was further declines in the rupee. This on an announcement that the Indian government is deciding to cut import duties on gold. On the back of that, we saw further weakness in the currency. Brent also in focus, some stabilization coming through despite some of the declines we saw. The energy complex is down 5% in the last 3 trading days. So we are seeing a bit of green on the board today, but the theme for this week has been one of declines. Speaking of commodities, I just want to draw your attention to what's been happening with freight shipping costs. Now, this is interesting. Remember, we've been talking about this on the show and the fact that June saw a massive uptick in the number of Houthi attacks on shipping vessels. And of course, over the weekend, we had that direct tit for tat go on between Israel and the Houthis. And here you can see that the container shipping costs have actually started to climb again. Cost of a 40-foot box is now almost $6,000 and on the rise. So keep a close eye on that as we talk about some of the inflationary headwinds that are to come perhaps in the next couple of months. So let's check in also on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril is in our Singapore studio standing by. We spoke about a bit of the weakness in the Indian rupee. What else are you watching out for today?
Well, Jumana, as you say, searching for clues from those Mag 7 earnings. That was seen as potentially the driver for markets today. And as those Tesla Alphabet earnings disappointed, underwhelmed investors, we're seeing Tesla suppliers declining in the region. The benchmarks are mostly lower. Chinese stocks are extending their losses. We're also seeing signs that the national team in China is pulling back support for equities. Looking at currencies as well, with the yen continuing its climb. Traders bracing for a rate hike from the BOJ next week. And there's chatter that it might not even be a 10 basis point climb, maybe an increase of 15 basis points. We're seeing the yen climbing not just against the greenback, but all its G10 peers as well today, Jumana.
Avril, thank you so much. All right, turning back to the U.S. presidential race, and Kamala Harris has taken aim at Donald Trump in her first campaign rally since launching her White House bid by referencing her past work as a public prosecutor.
In those roles, I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women, fraudsters who ripped off consumers, cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
Well, for more on this, Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn joins us now from Washington. Vonnie, it seems as though more details have started to emerge now over the virtual roll call and the nomination plan for Harris. What do we know?
Yes, Wednesday, Democrats are going to finalise a plan for this virtual roll call, Jumana, which could take place as early as August 1st. Now, it's a way of fending off any kind of accusations that there might have been anything less than fully democratic about this process, right? So it will allow for delegates to cast their votes publicly and many weeks now before the actual DNC. So it cements Kamala Harris as the Democratic choice, not somebody who was foisted upon the Democratic Party. It also, of course, just gets things moving going a little bit faster and keeps the enthusiasm and the momentum going, it also adds urgency potentially for her pick for a running mate. And we know that favourites are emerging. Two Democratic governors of red states, Pennsylvania's Josh Shapiro and North Carolina's Roy Cooper. And Mark Kelly of Arizona. Now, he's a senator, but the reason that he would be one of the favourites is that Arizona is a border state, and that's one of the areas that Kamala Harris is being attacked by MAGA Republicans on. They call her Joe Biden's border czar, which of course was not true, but it will be one of the areas she will have to defend herself against attacks.
And meanwhile, the donations keep flooding in. Yesterday, we were reporting that more than $100 million has already come in since she was, well, not announced, but is the presumptive presidential candidate. But it also seems like she's getting a boost from celebrity endorsements as well. So what can you tell us?
Well, you're talking about $100 million in donations. I mean, that's really only the tip of the iceberg, Jemana. So we're looking at endorsements now from, you know, almost anybody that you can think of that has ever had an opinion on democratic politics in the United States. I mean, Ariana Grande, Demi Lovato, Cardi B, John Legend, Barbra Streisand, they are coming in thick and fast. And on the Hollywood side of things, we're seeing George Clooney, who obviously had become a big name in this, Spike Lee, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Aaron Sorkin, who had written for the New York Times that, you know, perhaps the Democrats should nominate Mitt Romney. Well, he's come out and said now, actually, this is a much better choice. So I think the money is going to come in thick and fast. As we know, Abigail Disney has got on board. We have obviously plenty of Wall Streeters, from Ray McGuire of Lazard all the way through to some of the usual suspects like the Evercore partners and so on. So, yeah, that $100 million is a lot of money. She also still has that war chest. The Trump campaign did file a complaint to the FEC that she shouldn't be allowed to get her hands on that $96 million, but that likely won't go anywhere. It probably won't go to the courts. And we'll know in August, we'll know in the middle of August just how much more came in July. And by the way, I do want to mention that there have been 2 polls done, and it's very, very, very early days because she has just become the person to be at the top of the ticket. But those polls do show, one of them at least, shows her 2 points ahead of Trump, just 1 point behind. So both within the margin of error in a head-to-head matchup.
Yeah. I think one thing we can say for sure is the race has dramatically tightened since the weekend. Vonnie, thank you very much for your reporting, as ever. Well, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is preparing to address both houses of Congress today. Netanyahu is expected to use the speech to shore up support for the war against Hamas, including further U.S. measures against Iran and its proxies. So for more on this, Bloomberg's Dan Williams joins us now from Jerusalem. Dan, great to see you. Just give us a flavor for what the Prime Minister is expected to say. Obviously, this is a speech that has been widely anticipated. It's the 4th time he's been invited to address Congress. Do we have any inkling of what he's expected to say?
Well, as you noted in your opener, this is a time of extraordinary political upheaval in the United States, historical. And the Israeli Prime Minister will be making history of his own by becoming the 4th leader, the first foreign leader to appear 4 times before a joint session of Congress. He has previously been tied with Winston Churchill, and as the son of a historian, he'll probably be aware of the significance there. This is a man who is now caught up in what appears to be will soon be Israel's longest-running war, an open-ended war on several fronts. He will no doubt argue Israel's case. He will no doubt seek to place the blame at the feet of Iran, Israel's arch-foe. And at the same time, he will reach across the aisle to try to shore up bipartisan support for Israel in the United States. This is a core aspect of Israeli foreign policy going back decades, and it has eroded, especially in recent months with the war in Gaza, with some elements of the ruling Democratic Party openly coming out against Netanyahu and against Israel's conduct of this war.
Yeah. To what extent do you think this speech has actually been overshadowed by everything that has taken place within the U.S. domestic politics, the political upheaval that we've witnessed just in the last couple of weeks, and even within Israel itself?
I think very much so. I think the U.S. capital, Washington, is already beset with concern, with doubt, with speculation about what will be in the November election. And the Israeli Prime Minister is there. He can't have anticipated this. This speech was set up several weeks ago. He's been moving quite quickly to make sure that he has meetings with Biden, with the Vice President Harris, and indeed with the challenger, Trump, on Friday. These are in addition to his speech in Congress today. It's also worth remembering that back home in Israel, Netanyahu's domestic standing is not strong. There is growing concern that his conduct of the war may be influenced by his political considerations rather than strictly operational considerations. Keep in mind that some 120 hostages from the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th that triggered this war, they remain in captivity. The number of them dying in captivity is increasing. There is some rancor in Israel, and it's growing. It's no longer on the margins. Even while there has been support for the war, some of the public are questioning the timing, the need for this speech, and indeed whether, while burnishing his credentials as an international statesman, he may be neglecting the more burning issues back home. But as I said, what he will try to do is represent Israel's case. That's what we've been told by his aides. And indeed, at a time of real open partisan bickering in the United States ahead of the election, try to reassert Israel as a bipartisan issue. We'll, of course, see how that plays out in terms of protests around Congress when he appears, and also inside the House, how many Congress members turn up and applaud.
Yeah, well, indeed, security has been beefed up into the event, notably because there is concern that people are going to try to use it as an opportunity to express some of their protests towards the war. Bloomberg's Dan Williams, thank you very much. Also coming up, an underwhelming start to big tech earnings weighs on market sentiment. We get the macro perspective from Gulf Investments' Raffaele Bertoni next. This is Bloomberg.
I wanted to make some important changes that I think would improve the vehicle, the sort of the robo-taxi, the main thing that we're going to show, and we're also going to show off a couple of other things.
Tesla CEO Elon Musk there talking about the delay of the much-anticipated robo-taxi unveiling, now scheduled for October. Musk also asking for investor patience after a fourth straight quarter of disappointing profits for the EV maker. He says the company's current valuation is justified by its promise of autonomy and that anyone who disagrees should just sell. The stock fell in late trading, as you can see, by almost 8%. And shares of Google parent Alphabet also slipped in extended trading. That's even after the company reported a second quarter revenue beat boosted by cloud computing demand and search ads. So let's bring in Raffaele Bertoni, head of debt capital markets at Gulf Investment Corporation. Good morning to you, Raffaele. So we've had 2 out of the 7 of the Magnificent 7 reporting yesterday. The market seems to be underwhelmed. What is your perception of how the rest of this earnings season is going to pan out, given what we heard yesterday?
Good morning, Jomana. It's very interesting because Alphabet and Tesla are 2 completely different companies. And the common factor, in my view, is that after the strong rally we had on equities, and in particular on tech, the investor bar has been raised significantly. So even if Google reported an increase of 14% in revenues, the market perception was disappointing. Tesla is a different story. The problem with Tesla is essentially the automotive gross margin have been declining for quarters now, and was the main driver of this sell-off we had at the beginning of the year. Then Elon Musk has been very good in repositioning the company with the robotaxi and the AI. But the reality is that the market was expecting 16.4% in terms of in terms of gross margin, and they deliver 14.3%. What we can expect going forward is going to be probably a mix of results, but in order to have another rally in the tech market, we need a significantly surprise on the upside.
Yeah, it feels as though the bar of expectations is a lot higher, and then the comps are difficult as well versus where we were 1 year ago. So that's also going to be factored in. The big question investors had in the run-up to this is whether the rally that we've seen so far in U.S. stocks can broaden out, because so far it has been led by just a handful of these tech or AI stocks. Do you think that there is scope in the second half of the year for this rally to broaden out?
I think it has already started. We saw the good performance of small cap versus large cap, and this is probably a trend that will continue, especially if the Fed would deliver the rate cuts that the market are pricing at the moment. We know that small caps are more sensitive to interest rates than large caps, and that would obviously support this trend.
To what extent do you think some of these growth stocks that we talk about are not going to be immune to some of the geopolitical headwinds that are becoming front and center of the U.S. election campaign? If you listen to the likes of former President Trump, he's talked about tariffs. He's a fan of tariffs. And you've just got to think that in this world of increasing amount of protectionism and tariffs, it is the growth stocks, the ones that sell abroad to the rest of the world, that are right in the heart of it.
That's a good question, Jumana. Essentially, geopolitics is an element of the macroeconomic environment which is complicated to price by the market. The reality is that in the past few years, the fiscal dominance has been the main driver of the performance of the equity market. So going forward, it much depends on how increasing geopolitical tension we would have compared to the fiscal expansions that both candidates are promising. So it's going to be a balance between geopolitical tensions and fiscal expansion going forward.
Well, traditional macroeconomics would dictate, given there is so much fiscal expansion taking place, the dollar should not or does not deserve to be as strong as it is right now. We know it is the world's reserve currency, but at what stage does that fiscal expansion become incompatible with the strength of the USD?
That's a good point. We should expect some weakness of the dollar going forward on the back of this huge amount of debt that the U.S. The federal government is issuing. We need to bear in mind that over the past 4 quarters, the U.S. debt has increased of about 3 trillion. So every quarter, the federal government needs to find a new investor for almost 1 trillion. Obviously, this is a huge amount, and the appetite for U.S. Treasury is obviously lower. But on the other end, fiscal expansion, tax cuts in particular will continue to play a positive role on the dollar. So all in all, I don't expect a huge weakness of the dollar, but neither a strong rally. So we will probably navigate the next few months in a trading range for the dollar.
What do you think is more important for the trajectory of the USD? Is it fiscal policy, the language that comes out of the presidential candidates? Or is it what the Fed decides to do next? And the fact that we've got about 60 basis points of cuts priced in. If they go more than that, I think that would be a dovish surprise to the market that, in theory, should pose some downward pressure.
I think in the short term, what the expectation on the monetary policy will lead the market. But in the medium long term, it's going to be more the fiscal policy. And we saw already the steepening of the yield curve. We expect that this steepening will continue. And we favor the short and medium term of the curve compared to the long one. And at the moment, we are running a slightly longer duration position because of the Fed expectations are going to be the real driver. But medium term, we think that the duration has to be lower and is not going to be the main driver of the performance of the fixed income market, fixed income portfolio.
Okay, very clear. Raffaele, a pleasure to have you with us on the show. Raffaele Bertoni, Head of Debt Capital Markets at Gulf Investment Corporation. Thank you. Also coming up, LVMH sales slow as China's slump weighs on earnings, and Kering is in focus later. More on that next. This is Bloomberg. LVMH sales growth slowed last quarter as wealthy shoppers in China reined in spending on pricey Louis Vuitton handbags and Christian Dior couture. Later, investors will analyze Kering's earnings for signs that things are looking up for its biggest brand, Gucci. So for more on this, let's bring in our Asia Global Business Managing Editor, Rachel Chang, who joins us from Hong Kong. Rachel, one thing that has emerged so far from the earnings season is that sales growth into China has disappointed to the downside for many of these luxury brands. How did that show up for LVMH?
Yes, that's right. I mean, China is still a quandary that the luxury brands are not able to figure out. So for LVMH in the latest quarter, the region that includes China plunged in sales 14%, which is very disappointing, especially because people were hoping that LVMH would hold up better than the other luxury brands. But what's really complicating the picture is really the volatility in the region. So for example, we know that a lot of Chinese are going to Japan for shopping, where the weak yen has made luxury goods very cheap. So Japan, for example, LVMH saw almost over 50% surge in revenue. So, are the Chinese tourists really waiting to purchase in Japan? That's what LVMH is telling us. But I think there's also a broader concern beyond these travel patterns that, China is just not holding up as a luxury market.
Yeah, and obviously this show is being broadcast from the Middle East. How did LVMH perform in this region, and what does that tell us about luxury demand?
So in the Middle East, it only accounts for a very small portion of LVMH's sales so far, but it's showing up very strongly in LVMH's cosmetics, makeups category, which of course is led by Sephora, that's expanding very strongly and taking a lot of market share in the Middle East. And I think going forward, what we can tell from the earnings is that, China continues to be a very complex situation for these luxury giants, and we will see them try to focus more on other regions like the Middle East, where maybe the growth picture is a little bit more linear. They can count on that sort of aspirational middle-class consumer coming through, and really a region that doesn't have as much political risks as China does at the moment.
Yeah, interesting. Also, I didn't realize that Sephora was part of the LVMH umbrella, so you learn something every day. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. All right, also coming up, our next guest says Kamala Harris's stance on the Middle East remains unclear. Stay tuned for our conversation with Tina Fordham, geopolitical strategist and founder of Fordham Global Foresight, next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories. Asian stocks track Wall Street lower as U.S. tech earnings fail to impress. Tesla posting its fourth straight profit miss as Alphabet faces pressures to keep up on AI. Kamala Harris hits the campaign trail with a direct attack on Donald Trump, telling Americans they face a stark choice in November. Plus, European banks begin reporting today with the likes of Santander and Deutsche Bank on the docket. More details later as investors focus on trading revenue and investment banking fees. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi over here in Dubai. Let's get you caught up on these markets. We saw a bit of a negative day for the S&P and Nasdaq yesterday. By the close, they were down a fraction of a percentage point. But again, a lot of focus on those tech earnings coming through. We had Tesla and Alphabet report after the bell. Investors were a little bit underwhelmed. Both of those stocks trading negative in after hours. Alphabet down 2%, Tesla down 8%. Today, you can see Nasdaq futures tipping almost down 1% in after after hours. We are also keeping a close eye on the Indian rupee. The budget was unveiled yesterday. The rupee keeps weakening. We're at a record low, close to a record low versus the USD. This on an announcement that the government is looking to cut import duties on gold, one of the catalysts for further weakness, in addition to announcement of capital gains tax. So that's put pressure on the currency. And then Brent, seeing a bit of stabilization come through. The energy complex is being supported by the fact that U.S. stockpiles have gone down a little bit. But overall, the theme for this week is that oil is down about 5% over the course of the last 3 days. Finally, I just want to draw your attention to our terminal chart today. Really interesting to keep an eye on this. We've been talking about an uptick of Houthi attacks on the Red Sea. Look at what is happening to some of these container shipping costs. A 40-foot box is now back to almost $6,000 again. So something to keep in mind, of course, as we talk about the potential inflationary headwinds to come for central bankers in the coming months. All right, let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril is in our Singapore studio standing by. Avril.
Yeah, Jumana, I wanted to zero in on what we're seeing in Japan because tech stocks there are taking a hit on sentiment, no thanks to those underwhelming Mag 7 earnings, but also really worth highlighting what we're seeing in the automaking stocks today. Those are the big drags on the indices, and the losses there are accelerating as the session progresses, as the yen rallies. Traders now bracing for what we're going to see from the BOJ next week. There's chatter in the markets that we could see a supersized hike from the Japanese central bank, 15 basis points, not just 10. That was the increase that we saw in March. And as the yen rallies and we're seeing these expectations of the BOJ, that's going to put pressure on Japanese bonds. Indeed, we saw a really soggy auction for 40 years earlier today. The 10-year yield approaching the 1.08 level. Let's flip the board. I also wanted to show you what else we're seeing in FX because the Kiwi dollar and the Aussie dollar are sliding the most against the yen today because they also have the slide in commodity prices to contend with. Jumana.
Avril, thank you so much. All right, back to U.S. politics again. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris has used her first rally in swing state Wisconsin to attack Donald Trump and warn voters that they face a stark choice in November. Two fresh polls now suggest Harris is closing in on Trump, but the Trump campaign is downplaying the bump as a temporary Harris honeymoon that will last a while until the race settles back down. So let's bring in Tina Fordham, geopolitical strategist and founder of Fordham Global Foresight, for more analysis. I've got to say, Tina, just in the last week, it feels as though there is a totally different atmosphere within the Democratic Party. A week ago, we were reading reports about how demotivated they are, feeling very nervous about the upcoming election. And now, just in the first couple of days, it feels as though the party is once again feeling mobilized, energized. The donations are flooding in again. Does that continue?
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, it's definitely more than a vibe shift when it comes to the Kamala's endorsement and being on the campaign trail. It's a data shift. And as you said, the donations are rolling in. The Democratic National Committee reported in the first 24 hours after Biden stepped aside that it had seen the highest take in donations, especially what are called small dollar donations in history. So this is game on.
Yeah. One thing that I think is interesting is the shift in tone as well. And now the Democrats are going out on the offensive about Trump's age. And of course, that was a big Republican point up until, the events of the last weekend. How likely is that argument likely to resonate? How likely is it to resonate with some of the voters in swing states? I mean, should we still be talking about age?
Well, recall that around 62% of American voters are what is referred to as double haters. They didn't want to vote for either candidate. And so the Trump campaign is now really on the back foot. It emerged from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee last week, and we saw Harris there yesterday, thinking that it was going to sail to victory, having started to move ahead in the polls, which had remained pretty steady between Biden and Trump. Now it has a completely different ticket and needs to find a strategy fast.
Let me ask you to what extent you think foreign policy, and particularly the policy in the Middle East towards Israel, Gaza, is one that's going to resonate with voters. We know that a lot of the pro-Palestine vote has eroded. Some of the support for President Biden got eroded over the course of the last couple of months. How is that likely to influence the outcome of this elections, if at all?
Historically, as you know, foreign policy issues don't tend to move the needle very much on U.S. public opinion. But I was writing earlier this year about that feedback loop because the conflict in the Middle East and the White House's stance on supporting Israel so strongly definitely did engender some negative feedback. And what makes it worse, what made it worse for President Biden is that he was criticized both for his support for Israel by pro-Palestinian U.S. voters and for what was regarded as encouraging anti-Semitism, particularly in the U.S. campus protests by American Jewish voters. So it was really a lose-lose outcome. He expended a lot of political capital in his support of Israel and ended up really getting hammered from all sides. That's why I say Harris's stance is unclear.
Yeah, and that's the key. In a way, that's a strength because she's fresh and doesn't perhaps have the baggage that all of these other, a lot more vocal politicians do suffer from. But I wonder, from your standpoint, you're a geopolitical analyst. What do you make of the potential for a President Harris in the future? How would that change the calculus of U.S.'s relations with its allies? Or is it just too early to say at this point? Because we know where Trump stands.
Well, that's right. So Trump is a known quantity. We have Netanyahu's visit. Perhaps we'll talk about that later. And Trump has said that he'll bring peace in the Middle East on day one, revive the Abraham Accords, same as he said with Ukraine. The calculus of the other actors in the Middle East, from the governments to the militias and the other forces, is also now on the back foot with the emergence of Harris. I think we should expect her to be a continuity candidate when it comes to foreign policy, but with the exception of such full-throated support for Israel, if that makes sense. You know, like any presidential ticket, it was balanced. Joe Biden had decades of foreign policy experience. Kamala Harris, coming from the state of California as a prosecutor with a strong background on criminal justice and also on women and equality issues, doesn't have that record in foreign policy. It would take time for her to develop that. But right now, if I were advising her, I would say to keep her powder dry.
Yeah, that certainly appears to be the case and seems to be serving her well. But of course, it is early days. Tina, thank you so much for coming on our show today. Tina Fordham, geopolitical strategist and founder of Fordham Global Foresight. Thank you. Well, investors are more bullish on equities in South Africa, encouraged by President Cyril Ramaphosa's economic reform plans. The country's benchmark index has climbed more than 2% since the elections in May. So for more on this, Bloomberg's Africa correspondent Jennifer Zabataja joins us from Johannesburg. Jen, what is behind this investor optimism? Tell us.
Yeah, Joanna, it is welcome news for this country, especially if you think about a lot of the uncertainty that we got pre-election. So as you mentioned, yes, we are hearing from more fund managers who are saying they are upbeat and bullish about South African equities. And I want to start with this chart in particular, because as you mentioned, Johannesburg's all-share index since the election has climbed more than 2%. And as this chart is showing, it has actually outperformed the MSCI Emerging Market Index since that May 29th date. And I want to get into a little bit of why these investors are bullish. So if we take a look at this next chart, Bloomberg spoke to ABAX Investment Holdings, which is one of the investment managers here, and they said that they're actually increasing their exposure to specifically South African equities. And these are some of the equities in their performance since the election, and some of those that are interest rate sensitive. So we have ShopRite Holdings, which is a retail chain. We have Robux, which is a construction company. And we've also seen banks such as Standard Bank and FirstRand clearly performing in the green since the election. And a lot of the reason why is sort of what you alluded to in the intro, Jumana. And I want to take a look at this next chart, which is just showing exactly that. So President Cyril Ramaphosa gave his opening of Parliament address last week and really gave a lot of investors room to be supportive and encouraged about his direction. He said, and in quotes, he said that he wanted to turn South Africa into a construction site, alluding to the fact that he wants to see more infrastructure development. He also alluded to more market-friendly reforms and really was encouraging this new coalition government to tout more job creation, more employments, potentially opening the door then to more growth. And what we are hearing from investors is that they are not naive to the fact that, of course, this government is going to require a lot more work. There is going to be a lot more accountability that is needed. But perhaps the worst of it is behind us. And Jumana, just finally, on this last note, today we are going to get South Africa inflation figures, CPI, and as this chart shows, the expectation is potentially we will see inflation start to slow down. And of course, that could potentially then open the door to the South African Reserve Bank cutting interest rates later this year, which of course could mean more upside for South African equities. But yes, this is the picture right now, and we're going to be paying very close attention to it going forward.
Yeah, well, we spoke about the SARB decision last week. There were only 2 banks, I think, calling for a rate cut last week. So it certainly appears as though the foundation is there for a rate cut in the coming months. Jen, thank you so much for that overview. Jennifer Zavazaja, Bloomberg's Africa correspondent. Also, coming up, we're going to talk European banks. BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank and UniCredit are set to report results later today. More on what to expect next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Well, we are just getting some results come through. European banks are in focus today. BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank and UniCredit will be reporting second quarter results shortly. And in the interim, we are just waiting for results out of Santander as well, the Spanish bank. And when I get them, I'll break them to you. But for now, we're going to talk about the European bank earnings that are coming later today. Taking their cues from U.S. peers, investors will be watching out for investment banking fees and equity trading revenue. For more, Matt Ingram, our senior financials analyst at Bloomberg, is here. Matt, just give us a sense of what we should be watching out for. Maybe let's start with BNP Paribas, given all of the events that have taken place in French politics the last few months.
Sure. Good day, Jumana. Yeah, look, BNP, it's actually been nothing about fundamentals and all about politics and sentiment since the election. BNP's a mixed bag. We think revenue is going to be pretty weak, and that might offset some decent cost savings. Provisions are a bit of a swing factor. We think they're going to be okay. So there's a lot of moving parts for BNP. The end result might be slightly better than expected, but there's a lot going on. And really, I think that sentiment, you're going to need a good kick in earnings to offset that negative sentiment that we saw from the politics.
Yeah, I think that's going to be the major question on investors' minds. Deutsche Bank, we've got some legal issues hanging over the bank. What should we be watching out for there?
Yeah, look, it should be a stonking quarter for Deutsche Bank. As we discussed last week, the US investment banks, very good investment banking revenues, very good equity trading, but that 1.3 billion euro fine is going to be hanging over Deutsche Bank's head. That's also going to impact capital. So we think for now we've seen the last of the buybacks. So unless you see very strong revenues, this quarter is going to be all about that legal hit, and it's going to be all about managing through the capital side of that for now. But very strong investment banking and potentially strong equities as well for Deutsche.
Yeah, and the read across from U.S. banks to Deutsche Bank is going to be interesting because, as you say, they tend to be stronger on investment banking, equity trading. Finally, though, I want to ask you about UniCredit, one of the darlings of the European banking system over the last couple of years, a massive outperformance. They've been very generous with their capital and share buyback programs. What should we be watching out for today?
Yeah, look, UniCredit's a very interesting story. As a rule, the market tends to get less excited about costs than they do about revenue. But the UniCredit story has and probably will continue to be all about costs. Not only operating costs, but also we think they're going to come in much better than expected on credit costs as well. So that real push on risk management and that real push on cost control is going to see them come through okay in what is probably going to be a fairly weak quarter for them revenue-wise. They do have a high bar in 1Q, but even so, we think across the board for UniCredit, weaker revenues, but a continuation of that cost and possibly that capital story.
Excellent. Matt, thank you so much. And speaking of, we are just getting an announcement come through that UniCredit has agreed to buy Aon Bank, Vodeno, for about 370 million euros. So on a bit of an acquisition spree, this started last year, so far, most of the stakes that have taken place, or the purchases that have taken place, have occurred in Greece or in Eastern Europe. So interesting to see that they are also adding to that mix by agreeing to buy Aon Bank, Vodeno, for about 370 million euros as well. Now, I also want to bring you Santander earnings. They are now officially out again. So just to give you those numbers from Santander, Spanish bank, one of the banks that had been underperforming in Spain as of late, the second quarter net income has come in at 3.2 billion. That is slightly higher than the estimates of 3.13 billion. Return on tangible equity coming in at 16%, again, higher than estimates of 14.8%. Cost of risk is still at around 1.2%. That's pretty much in line with expectations. CET1 ratio fully loaded above 12%. So that is a healthy number for the Spanish bank. Still looking to get more information come through, particularly because Santander tend to be so exposed to net interest income and some of the headwinds coming through from Latin America. You talk about some of the higher interest rates in Brazil and the fact that the U.S. haven't started cutting interest rates yet are likely to weigh on the bank's earnings. That is one of the reasons for Santander's underperformance versus its peers. But so far, from what we can see, the net income figure has come in higher than expectations. And just on a programming note, we're going to be speaking to the Santander CFO, Jose Garcia Cantera, at 10:30 a.m. Dubai time, right here on Bloomberg. All right, switching to airlines now. Coming up, Airbus is turning down orders as supply chain concerns and soaring demand for commercial aircraft weighs on the aviation sector. We hear from the Airbus CEO, Guillaume Faury, next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Airbus has been forced to turn down some orders because of its huge backlog and increasing demand for commercial aircraft globally. CEO Guillaume Faury discusses supply chain concerns and political uncertainty in France with Bloomberg's Guy Johnson.
There's no direct impact for us, but it's more of the latter, meaning we need the ability to have political decisions, to have a political environment that is able to navigate the challenges that the region has. So it's nothing direct, but more indirect impact for us.
In terms of where we are with the economy right now, some data seeming to suggest that we are seeing a slowdown. We referenced earlier on what was happening with the slowdown that some of the narrow-body carriers, the Ryanairs of this world, are seeing. What do you see in terms of demand going forward? Does it remain as strong as it is right now? Do you see an economic slowdown coming in our future? Europe is kind of growing slowly at the moment. There's signs maybe of a slowdown in the United States. What is your estimate of kind of what the economic picture looks like right now? Just to be clear,
we don't see a slowdown in the demand for commercial airplanes. Yeah. There's maybe a bit of softening of the acceleration of the pace, but it's increasingly important. We see that the estimation for the forecast for the fleet is again a doubling in the next 15 to 20 years. So the demand around the world for flight is really increasing. And that's what we're serving. So we don't see it as a recession. Yeah. It continues to be an increase.
Well, that takes me on beautifully to my final question, which is, you talk about a doubling, you talk about this huge amount of demand, you talk about this insatiable appetite for aircraft. Does the infrastructure exist to provide that? Does the fuel infrastructure exist? Will it exist to provide that. Europe is struggling this summer with ATC issues, with airport issues. We can build lots of aeroplanes, but are we building the kit that serves the aeroplanes, the fuel that fuels the aeroplanes? And I'm just wondering whether or not there are now limiting factors beginning to creep into the market, which may subdue the demand that you're talking about.
Well, there's always some local situation here and there, but globally the aviation system is growing. It continues to grow fast. Aviation is an industry where you don't need a lot of infrastructure to provide the service. You need an airport at the takeoff, at the departure, and an airport at the arrival.
But you need air traffic control in the middle, and you need fuel to put those...
Which we have. So we are very far from having saturated the skies. Even in Europe here, you see the sky is empty. So there's plenty of room to grow.
Quite close by.
And the infrastructure is the air. So we are benefiting from a natural infrastructure that is there, which is not the case for other means of transport. So we are just at the beginning of aviation. We need to get organized, and of course there are bottlenecks here and there in the growth, but there's still a lot of potential for growth.
That was the Airbus CEO at the Farnborough International Air Show speaking to Guy Johnson. All right, I also just want to bring you more earnings that are coming through from Equinor. And just to give you the headline here, the second quarter adjusted operating income after tax came in at $2.15 billion. That is a beat versus $2.1 billion estimates. Average production also slightly higher than estimates. Just in terms of commentary, they're keeping the capital distribution for 2024 of about $14 billion. They do plan to start the third tranche of the buyback of up to $1.6 billion. That should be starting soon. In terms of renewable power generation for 2024, it is estimated to increase by around 70% compared to the 2023 level. So definitely big increase in outlook there. The ambition is to keep the unit of production cost in the top quartile of its peer group. All right, that is it for our show. That was Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Versace in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.